Welcome to season 2 of Fresh Off the Board. I'm delighted to be interviewing Ratnika Prasad, a student I've known since 2008-9. And it was fantastic working with you back then and also following your journey. So, why don't you introduce yourself, Ratnika, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Ratnika Prasad. I'm perhaps less typical of the kind of students Arjun used to have, though I know he has a ton more now. I grew up in Kerala in a small city in India called Trivandrum, and then moved to Delhi where I did my 11th and 12th, and that's when I started working with Arjun. So I went on to go to Cornell, where I was a Tata Scholar, and I studied environmental science and environmental economics at Cornell. I then worked at Bain as a consultant for 3 years. I spent two in San Francisco and one in Southeast Asia, which was a pretty fantastic experience. But my heart had always been in the sustainability space. And ultimately, that's what I came to after graduate school. So I was at Harvard. I did a joint master's in development economics at the Kennedy School and an MBA at Harvard Business School. And since then have been in sustainability, where I first worked at the Environmental Defense Fund, and I now work at the Nature Conservancy. At TNC, I help launch, design, and scale up market-based conservation projects. So really working at the intersection of sustainability, finance, and business strategy.
Fantastic. So many students who we work with are keenly sort of looking at being change makers, understanding sustainability and issues related to environmental science and how it could impact and improve the world we live in. Yeah, so there was a bit of a lag, so I think I stopped then. So, the idea of interviewing students for this season was also to get what they wanted based on feedback we heard was, why don't you talk about getting in first and what was it like settling in later? So I said, okay, let's reverse the order of questions. I know it's been 10 years when you started thinking about the process and 8 years when you went to college. What is it like as a high school student back then for you to apply and succeed in the process? And what advice would you give in retrospect to people listening as to what actually it means to apply?
Yeah. It feels funny, but like a lot of it is pretty clear to me just because I think my understanding of the world as an applicant in terms of what it took to succeed in the application process is so different now. And in some ways feels full circle now that I'm often the person writing somebody a letter of recommendation. So when I was an applicant, I used to live in Trivandrum before this. I didn't know anybody personally that had studied in the US until I moved to Delhi. I would say I had a pretty black and white understanding of a process that I consider to be really gray. So in my mind, if you had the best scores, if you had, I guess, the best positions in a set series of extracurriculars, that was what would be needed. And in terms of my approach to what colleges to apply to, perhaps in a very equivalent way to how Indian college systems can work, I was like, I went by rankings. I mainly only applied to the Ivy Leagues and a couple of other schools. And my selection was largely driven by, what was the highest ranking school I got into, slash the one that gave me the best financial aid. And in hindsight, I would say if I could go back in time, I would change two things. One is I cannot emphasize this enough, even though you told me this, Arjun, like the essay writing process is probably the most important, like in a truly make or break your like application, just because there are so many talented people with the best scores and the best activities and so on. And so being as honest as possible in the essays and trying to craft them in a way that makes you stand out as the unique person you are rather than trying to fit a narrative is really important. And I see this now a bit better also because, I'll look at students' essays and it's just pretty easy to spot when you're trying to write to please somebody else as opposed to being authentic. So I would have tried to do that harder. And funnily enough, a lot of the schools that I got into, like Cornell and U Chicago and UPenn, I think those were the essays I felt the best and the most genuine about when I'd applied to. So it feels like that does show up in your application. The second thing I'd say is, understanding that you're probably going to be very young when you're making this decision. I would still say if you have a general sense of what you're interested in, to go by looking at how the school does on that field rather than thinking about the school's rank or reputation in particular. Since then, I've just been so impressed by the breadth and caliber of some of the schools here that, like, have excellent environmental programs, like everything from Middlebury to University of California, Santa Cruz. Like, there are some really, really good schools here that may not be on your radar if you just go by rankings. So if you think you're interested in a particular field, I'd say really try to understand schools from that perspective rather than just ranks.
An excellent answer to the question, because very often when we say it, it might not resonate so much, and parents say it doesn't resonate with kids at home at all. So yeah, it's just good to hear from someone like you. Things like understanding your preferences, digging deeper, telling your honest story, linking things with your passions, and sort of showing them on paper in the application. So come to think of it, you stuck to what you initially thought in terms of, I mean, at least one of your essay, I remember sort of even using it for a workshop recently, was Math Society, and it had some linkages with environmental sort of science. Very, very sort of deliberate ways to sort of push your candidature. But when you ended up being in Cornell, what was it like? How was it like settling in, and also using all the resources in the 4 years? What were the highlights of your academic journey?
So Cornell was amazing. I think it's one of the best schools you can go to unequivocally, and I highly, highly recommend it for anyone considering it. Um, I would say, it's a big school, and in some ways that works to your advantage because there's a lot of opportunity for you to find a place where you fit in, find groups that you fit in, lots of different activities. Like, there's not one particular character type or activity type that Cornell lends itself to. And I actually think that just makes it easier for everyone to find a home there. So it's pretty easy that way. I had an amazing time. Like, I think, I came in with this idea that I cared about sustainability. So I explored that in terms of the classes I took and the activities that I engaged in. But I was also pretty open in terms of just wanting to explore different activities and different classes. And to that extent, like, some of the best parts of Cornell for me were just like the unexpected discoveries. Like, academically, I took a lot of environmental science classes and a lot of environmental economics classes. But then, for instance, I took an art class this one semester. I studied in DC, and I took a Southeast Asian politics class this one other semester. And classes like that are just amazing at these kinds of schools because they have the best professors, and the way they teach it is often so different from how you might encounter a humanities class in India. So that was amazing. But I ended up randomly joining the debate team, which ended up being my home for 4 years. I'm still best friends with pretty much almost all of the people that I knew at debate. And so I think just being open to whatever experience like college brings you, while trying to keep a little bit of a track so that you don't lose yourself completely, is probably a good idea. Even that said, though, I'd say, like, I could have been more open to experiences, and I often like look back and think I wish I had taken some of the opportunities to go work abroad. Like, these schools are just full of research opportunities and travel abroad and study abroad and work abroad. And honestly, I think a lot of those things are just outside the realm of my ability to think of how a college should be, but they're definitely opportunities you can take advantage of. And there's often financial resources available to support that as well.
Fantastic. So let's dig deeper into environmental science and environmental economics. For students who are keenly interested in knowing more about these majors, what would you sort of use as a sort of a summary which could be useful for them?
Yeah. So I think the preface that I'd give with that is to say, in India, if you've gone through CBSE or ICSE, like in my case, I went through the CBSE system. At least when I was in school, not to date myself too much, you had to pick a track, right? Like, you could be science, or you could be commerce, or you could be humanities. And in my case, I picked humanities. That doesn't stop you when you go to college. So in environmental science, I was taking, physics, chemistry, bio, advanced math. I had a friend, her name's Divya at Yale. She similarly did a full-on science degree despite being humanities in school. So just wanted to add that preface, because all of that's to say, what you decided to study in 11th and 12th doesn't have to be the limiting factor for what you study in college. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about being in a system like the one in the US. Environmental science and economics is a pretty broad and very cross-disciplinary field by need, right? Because we're talking about big, complex challenges that society needs to solve. And I would say, it was a mix of a lot of science, like you'll do a lot of ecology, which was fun. We do things like learn how to like be in labs, or tree quizzes, which I wasn't the best at with American trees, all the way down to environmental social science classes. So understanding the history of conservation, so that you kind of understood why the big nonprofits are the major ones today, or how, certain practices such as scientific ecology develop. It was like all the way down to data analysis, where you look at everything from looking at population data to understand if a certain species is dying out, to looking at earth science data to see if the icebergs are truly melting. It kind of goes all over the place. And then you can choose to be a more science person, you can choose to be a more analysis data science person, an econ person, a policy law person. And it's a pretty awesome field because all of those options stay open to you after college.
So yeah, thanks, Ratnika, for that overview. One last question related to club societies and other things that you've done, and in terms of opportunities that you got as a delegation to UNFCCC, and also being part of organizations like Lights of Cornell. What would you advise students to do while they're researching schools? Obviously, they could get in touch with folks like you, or look at LinkedIn profiles, and then match their interests and sort of even mention it in interviews or things like that. What would you advise students to do who are applying in terms of research to dig deeper and learn from people like you?
Yeah, so LinkedIn was perhaps not as big a thing when I was applying, but I do think it's a pretty excellent resource. I also think most colleges have really bolstered what they put on their undergrad admissions page. So admissions blogs are actually a pretty useful way to see what someone's life might be like. A couple of things I'd add that I actually think are pretty representative would be, one, look at the page not just for the college, but also for the majors. So you can, like, if you go to the general college page, it'll show you all of their majors. And if you click at the majors, you can see what kind of courses you might take your first year in college. They'll then link to specific students who might have written blogs about being in that major. They'll often also have examples of the kind of internships that students can do. So I think that can be pretty helpful. And then the second thing that I'd advise there is to try to look at profiles of some of the professors. I'd written about a few of the professors in my admissions essays. I have no idea if it helped or not, but what I can tell you is that that's a really cool way to also like understand what kind of people might be teaching you. And sometimes, it turns out that one of them might have written a textbook that you use in high school, or one of them is just somebody that's famous that you've heard of. I think that's the other piece that I'd recommend.
So thank you, Ratnika. It's just fantastic catching up. And we'll also do a segment for LinkedIn audiences, which will be more related to what you're doing at B School, or you did at B School, and work at National Conservancy. So looking forward, and stay in touch.
Sounds good. Thank you.